The modern age is over. Quite a bold statement, repeated many times, and call it trivial. Well, in this podcast we'll try to provide some clarifications of it. Now, historical hypotheses or historical claims of wide scope are almost always, if not always, to some degree at least, vacuous. That is to say, they miss the fullness of content that should be contained in them, or to which they should indicate. And this is quite normal because talking about history and epochs of history, these meaningful wholes that form the periods or the different segments of history that are somehow contained in themselves, individualized, one might say, are always prone to be, at least to some extent, completely off the mark. However, there is one thing that one can guess and one can claim and really be pretty exact about it. And this is the statement about absence of something. So when I say that modern age is absent, that is not here anymore, I believe that there is a good basis for saying this and defending this statement, not merely by rhetorics, or as is sometimes, as has been sometimes tried in philosophy of history, with trying to provide some kind of inner logic to history, explaining it away in an apodictic manner. Something that is not very popular anymore among the academic philosophers, but was popular, for instance, in 19th century and first half of 20th century. The statement of absence is something quite different. And stating of absence, if it is true, if it doesn't miss the mark, can provide you with an ability to understand what was present before it became absent. Now let us cut with the abstractions and explain what we mean. Namely, a lot of times we mention this eventuality that is not really obvious to everybody, least of all intellectuals, that modern age is not here anymore. But we do think in terms of it. I think by inertia. What is not present? Well, the thing that is not present is, for instance, belief in the constant and perpetual, in fact, development, evolution, as is sometimes called, of science, that is to say, scientific knowledge, and constant progressive embetterment of society. I think that, all appearances aside, these beliefs do not move people anymore. I don't think these beliefs have any substance. One of the reasons, if I may be subjective for a moment, is that I remember the times when they really were present. And once they gone, it was very easy to feel the emptiness they left behind. Although at the first glance, especially if you're a young man, you don't see the real reason why there is something vacuous and empty causing all kinds of strange moods of anxiety or even nausea that are particular for the experience of nothingness in one's life. This is something that is very noticeable in our day and age. And the real cause for this, as I said, is that the principle that was forming the worldview and the mentality of the epoch that lasted for, let's say, from our generational point of view, rather long, because it is older than one generation, but in a historical sense rather short, is not here anymore. Something else is here. And this different thing that is often called post-modernity is very hard to decipher, if indeed impossible to decipher, because it seems to be the process of dissolution of what was before it. That is to say, it can be understood as the explication of the modern principles to their logical conclusion. Now, by saying this, I'm already trying to interpret. So this is something that is very much giving itself to errors. Whereas I would say that absence is just affirming the absence of something is not so open to errors once it is done properly. You just point a finger and say it is not there. I'll try to, although this is something that cannot be really exhausted in a form of talking about it in some kind of lecture or even some kind of study, I do think that it can be progressively qualified and pointed out for everyone to see. Namely, the reason why it is important to be pointed out is because a lot of people, that is to say, the majority of those who constitute, let's say, public awareness or public consciousness, to which politicians in our democratic day and age have to in some way recur and have to take it in account to rule, is still living in the belief that modernity and modern mentality is present, and the ideals of modernity are what is important and what is the benchmark upon which we evaluate, for instance, politics, some kind of politics of good and bad. I don't really think, in essence, that this is the case anymore. That I think that those beliefs and this, as we call it, public consciousness of political communities of various kinds is in fact quite erroneous. There is public unconscious also in some way, and it I think knows better, but we'll leave that for another occasion to talk about. Let's illustrate what we mean by this, because these things are best talked about in stories, not in an attempt to give philosophical or at all scientific statements. Now, Europe, until the fall of the Berlin Wall, was divided roughly to east and west in a political sense. Now, I always shudder to give these geographical determinations, especially of European countries, because this is very complex thing. My country is, one can say, part Eastern, part continental, Middle Europe, part Balkans, and there are always debates raging about how these qualifications have to be drawn. But in political sense, there was a division between communist and democratic liberal bloc. And there were very subtle subdivisions, of course, in those blocks themselves. But to cut a long story short, countries that were under communism lag behind their counterparts in the West for a very, very long period of years. They lag, I think, in ideological sense, 30 years behind the West. And those countries, peoples of those countries experienced the breaking down of the metaphysics of modernity in its communist mode. They saw it break down. They saw something that gave form to their experience, to their social life, to everything, dissolve almost overnight. And this dissolution is still afoot because communism, in its relicts, in the new generation of politicians that are in fact descendants, sometimes even direct family descendants of the old ones, especially if they worked for secret services, are still largely in power. But that's the other matter completely, because ideology never mattered much for those people. From that vantage point, you are quite attuned to notice the absence of modernity, because one form of modernity you have already seen dissolving. So when people from those countries go to work in more Western countries like Germany maybe, but Ireland or Britain were better examples, they tend to notice strange discrepancies in not only in attitudes but in values. And I'm not talking here about moral values and such, but the way, for instance, how you evaluate successful society. Now, a good deal of those guest workers just become enamored by ability to make money and to actually save some money from their work, and they leave it at that, and they consider those countries as benchmarks of success. However, there are many more people, a silent majority, that consider those countries to be in discrepancy. That they have a lot of money, for instance, that on all the graphicons and all the various reports about world wealth, they are at the top somewhere, whereas there's countries somewhere in the lower middle, compared only to Africa and African countries and other really poor ex-third world countries. Yet they see that those Western countries are quite inferior in a quality of education, in overall culture, and even in a way people social services work than their countries of origin. They sometimes mistakenly attribute this to some good qualities of communism. I would say this has nothing to do with it. What this has to do with is that people from this, let's qualifiedly call it Eastern Europe, still cling by inertia to modernity far more than those in the West, because what was real in the modernity was that which was drawn from pre-modernity. For instance, to give you an example, to switch to philosophy just a moment, Kant's categorical imperatives, or these moral principles of treating every human being as an end in itself and so on and so forth, are in fact a form of secularization of already existing metaphysical and religious principles, even revealed facts of Christianity. But in postmodernity, as they are just, of course, let's say, faint echoes of the real thing, postmodernity dissolved them already. It dissolved them in the West, but it didn't dissolve them all the way in the East. Because in the East, through communism, it is my hypothesis, now I'm talking about hypothesis, I'm talking very offhand, so these are things that are not to be taken as carved in stone. My hypothesis is that communism really was quite, by its intrinsic logic, quite prone to conservatism. It was absolutely conservative once in power. And after the first period of trying to destroy everything in its path, it just started conserving and preserving the pre-modern forms of existence that were still there, because all those countries that came under communism were to different degrees not entirely modernized. Not all of them, I'm sorry. For instance, Czech Republic was a decisively modern country at time of falling under Russians and falling under communism and later under Russians. But there were forms that were at least in the early modernity stage, and communism preserved them at that stage. So this connection to something that is pre-modernity, because modernity is not self-contained, that's a specificity of modernity, that it considers itself unique as an epoch to end all epochs in a way, and to interpret them in its own forms of understanding. But this is an illusion, because every epoch has a cause and has a root, and modernity also has a root, and this root is more preserved in countries such as mine, such as Hungary, probably, such as Serbia or Czech Republic, one very, very essentially civilized middle European, continental European country, preserving a lot of its roots, I would say, and so on. So people who come in the West, what they see, what they do is they judge their hosts by criteria of modernity, whereas English or UK or Ireland, especially Ireland, are not modern countries anymore. This is the whole distinction I always want to point out. This is most important. They are not modern. When I say no, I mean no. They are not form of modernity. There is no modernity in them anymore. So criteria are different. Criteria of science today, as far as I can see, is not linear progress. It's more like the play, a theoretical science at least, the play of world images, the play of myriad of different branches of sciences in which science is dissolved, completely losing the purpose. The only purpose is practical application, but even that is questionable. For instance, one good example of trying to be modern in the midst of postmodernity is to say that the real purpose of scientific investigation is serious application of something. That is to say, finding out or discovering serious applications. But what applications and what appliances of science make most money all the time? Mostly entertainment, I would say. The criteria of postmodernity is such that hierarchy that is essential for any kind of morality or aesthetics, for any kind of good and beautiful. Of truth we won't speak anymore at all. It brings down all hierarchies, and once this is done, there is no criteria anymore. And this is the thing. So some, I don't know, Croat or Pole comes to Ireland and he's astonished with a country that has big GDP. You can get a job relatively easily compared to our countries. But then you see completely undereducated young people, very limited in their knowledge, ideologically brainwashed, but this is separate thing, really completely ideologically brainwashed populace. But what is important, they see horrible state of the roads, bureaucracy, irresponsible, lazy, chaotic bureaucracy, and so on and so forth. So they try to make judgment inference, well, this is a backwards country, and in fact it is, but it is also ultra progressive. How can these two things exist at the same time? Well, in postmodernity it's normal that they coexist, because nothing really exists. When I say this, I mean nothing that it has an essence, nothing that can be called a purposeful act. Everything is in chaos, and chaos and nothingness are roughly equivalent. And they disclose themselves to us through our understanding and through our, what is called ontological moods, Heidegger's accomplishment, one of those that I begrudgingly affirm to him. And this is the state of the West, in some sense. This is the fact that modernity is no more. And judging by modern criteria, you can very easily put yourself in the position that you're coming from dirt poor country in the supposedly developed world, and that your experience of this world will be that it is not really underdeveloped, but de-developed, as if it is, while money amount of this abstract money of finance is exponentially growing. Let's say I'm talking in hypothesis images, but the culture, in the most simple sense of the word, the ways of society, the purpose of society, is completely inexistent. Maybe this is quite normal for postmodernity. This is what postmodernity is, and this is what awaits those Eastern countries if they would reach that stage. But I'm not so sure they will, because this end of modernity is in fact modernity demasking itself as a lie that it was, in essence. It had true in itself, and this truth will survive. But the lie will not survive, because once it is disclosed, it dissolves. It is nothing. And postmodernity could be understood as this disclosure. Disclosure of a lie. Dissolution of what only seemed to be real. So this is what we mean by this fact that modernity is absent. I hope that this clarification was clear enough, because I noticed that some people are questioning me about what I mean by this. So this is it. Anyways, just to note, I'm working on some projects, one of them being one article in metaphysics that is pretty demanding, and it will take some time until I am satisfied with its finished form. and they will return to doing videos on specific philosophers, and this time around with a minimum of criticism and interpretation. We'll try to make it a kind of series of lectures. This, I think, especially interesting for those who are studying philosophy or are interested in philosophy and not so much interested in how I interpret it, because one has to be able to give impartial exposition of Kant or some of those great philosophers before trying to put them in the context of some meaningful development or the development of philosophy. Anyway, thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic, Kali Tribune, signing out.